All right, good afternoon, class. This is John Van Slyke. Welcome back. As I mentioned at the end of class today, I didn't get quite as far into my presentation as I hoped, and we kind of got right through to the significance of the frontier and what that might have, started to mean in terms of a changing ideal of manhood for the United States, and particularly its men in the late 19th century, and of course then by extension women. But so I want to just take a few more minutes, actually probably closer to 10 minutes or so, to talk to you and put some of the finishing touches on my explanation. And I'll click through here if you want to take the time. You can obviously pause the screencast and you could update your notes as you see fit. And I don't honestly know how Dr. Similink Johnson intends to use my comments, if they'll be part of a assessment of any kind later. So I'll leave that to you to determine what makes the most sense for you as you prepare for next steps in your course. Anyway, it was a pleasure to be with you all today. And we, of course, we're building this early foundation for what sort of the standard of manliness meant in terms of an earlier ideal of American manhood. And then, as was suggested in my comments, the closing of the frontier and sort of the frontier anxiety that resulted from that subtle yet important period, that crossover of that threshold in American history around 1890 was really important. And it's probably also worth noting that in 1921 is the first year in American history where we can think of the United States as being an urban culture, meaning over half of the people who lived in the United States, starting in 1921, lived in an urban context as opposed to a rural context, which speaks a little bit to this early process of Jeffersonian democracy and the importance, significance of the frontier. So this is where we left off. So frontier anxiety is this, this sort of widespread or widely felt nervousness about what the future would hold for the still young United States. I mean, in 1890, we were barely a century old. And if all of the United States' existence up until 1890 had consisted of this seemingly limitless expanse of land, and of course, as Turner said, the incredible values and lessons that Americans learned from going out and sort of domesticating that land, turning it from wilderness to farmland or grazing land or commercial land, so on and so forth. What would now happen? So it's also worth noting that the 1890s was a difficult decade in American history. It was struck by a widespread recession, which of course meant that many more Americans than usual, found themselves unemployed. It was also at a time when immigration into the United States, particularly along the eastern seaboard, was being more closely watched. There were concerns that the quality of life in American cities, largely due to industrialization, was decaying. We had, tenement housing with inadequate disposal of waste. This is still in the age. We don't have electricity or plumbing in a meaningful way in the United States. So there are all sorts of concerns, and one of the ways in which this expressed itself was by placing restrictions upon immigration, particularly from different parts of the world. This was a very difficult time for Chinese immigrants to find a safe or welcome home in the United States. Likewise, this was a difficult time for many immigrants from southeastern Europe. So, and I guess also just southern Europe as well. So one of the things I want to suggest is that in the context of this, for the American male, and this phrase works for me. I think I know that this has been discussed in the literature, maybe psychological or sociological literature, But one of the things that starts to happen is if we think about that prior ideal of American manliness, that standard of manhood, I'm thinking now of Pa Ingalls and sort of the Jeffersonian yeoman farmer out making his own existence authentically on his individual plot of land. That standard of malehood was one very rooted in being, and being a man. What we're going to start to see as American men come into closer proximity to one another and they come into greater competition with one another, it seems as if the American male is now going to start to be less authentic and be more sort of a creature that is defined in relative terms to the men around him. So my earlier comment about adolescing versus not adolescing, for whatever reason we start to see more American men who are seeming like men or seeming like individuals of strong character rather than actually being individuals of strong character. And that there's a big difference there. It sounds subtle, but it's big. It's this notion of, men defining for themselves what their manhood should be based on their values and their own character versus adopting what they think the larger culture is telling them is the acceptable standard of manhood. So immigration is, as I mentioned, a real concern at this time, partly because if the frontiers closed, and the frontier was the great sort of laboratory experiment that helped Europeans transform themselves into Americans. I shouldn't say laboratory experiment, more like a laboratory, a process through which Europeans are transformed into Americans. If there's no more frontier, then can America rightly and reasonably continue to have its doors open when there is no longer available that process, which is what has made Americans who they are? This, of course, being the late 19th century. So along comes Teddy Roosevelt, and he's a figure who looms very large in American history. In fact, he physically looms very large as one of only 4 faces of white American men on the famed Mount Rushmore. And so Teddy Roosevelt is very much aware of this frontier anxiety and the challenges facing the United States in the late 19th century. And there's a lot we could say about, we could have a few lectures on just Teddy Roosevelt himself, but to keep things fairly brief here, he becomes a strong proponent, a strong advocate of American men living the quote-unquote strenuous life. And it's an interesting concept that he puts forth. He comes along the scene in the 1880s. He begins as a New York State senator. And what's interesting about Teddy Roosevelt is, even though, just a second, let me try to fix this if I can. Not quite sure what happened there, but I'm hoping I can fix it. We'll try this. Pardon me as I race through to get to where we are. So he comes along the scene in the 1880s, and he is the son of a very aristocratic family. He's very well off, but he has this high-pitched voice. He's not very large of stature as a young man. He kind of had a sickly childhood where he suffered from various, I think he suffered from asthma, and he even gets nicknamed, and this is not a very tough name, but the his early colleagues in the New York Senate referred to him as Pumpkin Lily. Not exactly a powerful name. But he realizes that he's going to have to sort of reinvent himself, and sadly, as a young man, he loses his wife quite suddenly. And he uses the next several months, I think it's actually a couple of years, he relocates out to South Dakota to sort of reinvent himself as a rugged individual. But as he defines this concept of the strenuous life, and he even wrote a book called The Strenuous Life, he's speaking about the importance of American men carrying the mantle of civilization. And he thinks of this in largely racial terms, like white European men have been given this special role, much as white European civilization has been given this role, to sort of lead the world forward. And so he has both a gendered and racial interpretation of the important duty and work that should befall the white race, and particularly the male gender. And so this is really important to understand as we start to think about some of the solutions that are going to be put forth to respond to the challenges of frontier anxiety. And so it's probably at this moment that we really start to see a shift from the male standard of manliness to this new male standard of masculinity. And really the crossover word is probably honor, because honor was central to the old notion of manliness, the character, the authentic, the word is your bond. But now honor is going to be repackaged in a way that shows that person or those persons, those males, capable of carrying forward the full promise of European civilization. And the United States will be, according to Teddy Roosevelt, at the forefront of this. And the national supremacy of the United States is closely linked to the possibilities and the abilities of the entire white race to continue to lead civilization forward. So this is going to require something new. The frontier is gone. But what Teddy Roosevelt is going to do is he's going to reinvent in this strenuous life different ways that American men, or men in general, can continue to remain hardy, strong, and tough, even in the absence of the frontier. So one of the ways that's done is hunting. Here's a picture of the young Teddy Roosevelt, probably in South Dakota. Maybe he's hunting bison. Who knows exactly? Another way is through organized sports. It's no surprise that college football and not too long thereafter, professional football will enter onto the American stage in the early 20th century. And also sports like boxing. Again, these are kind of tough, rugged sports where men collide at high speeds and sort of physically and aggressively demonstrate their prowess, one versus the other. You can imagine, if you can't any longer go out on the frontier and physically work yourself and demonstrate yourself, now we can do this in the stadiums and on the fields of the new changing American culture. And then finally, war is going to be a central way. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt somewhat famously mocked President McKinley at the tail end of the 19th century and said, President McKinley is essentially a wuss because he won't lead us into war against Spain, even after the Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor in Cuba. And so this becomes, so hunting, organized sports, and war. Teddy Roosevelt actually thinks that war is going to be the next step that helps teach American men, young American men, how to maintain their vitality. And of course, this is a much more aggressive and quote-unquote masculine expression of manhood. So as I put my finishing touches, and bear in mind this, there are two other segments to what I put forth in my master's thesis. But what we see here is the western frontier is going to be on one side of the masculine divide, and on the other side will be eastern cities. And I mentioned in class the feminine eastern cities. Rugged America versus genteel Europe, the feminine. Agency, the active making things happen, which is something that we might associate with the American Western, versus accepting the status quo. That's what Europeans do. And I have here a important quote that I'll end with. This is a quote from Owen Wister's Western called the Virginia. In it, there's a very important commentary that says, "It was through the Declaration of Independence that we acknowledged the eternal inequality of man. For by it we abolished a cut-and-dried aristocracy, We had seen little men artificially held up in high places and great men artificially held down in low places. And our own justice-loving hearts